Your name popped up because I saw the Air Force Cross being awarded, I think, to the 24th Tactical or Tactical Squadron Airmen for the Battle of Kasham back in 2018. And that was your article. I think I saw it carried on Military Times. I know there's probably some syndication that I don't know anything about, but can you talk to me a little bit about that article that you wrote there and broke? And then I would probably start really with like what that battle was, the significance, and for those who aren't too familiar with it.
Yeah, sure. So people who aren't familiar, I guess I'll just start with the layout of like northeastern Syria at the time of these events in 2018, and also basically how it stands today too. So there's a lot of different nations that have their fingers in the Syria pot. One being the United States, who backs the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a primarily Kurdish led militia in northeast Syria. We used them a lot to fight ISIS, and after ISIS was defeated in like the territorial sense, it lost its caliphate. We continue to remain in the country backing the SDF and helping them, one, like making sure ISIS doesn't rise again, but also there's probably a lot of geopolitical considerations for the reasons why we hang around in that region. And, one of the geopolitical considerations is Russia backs the Assad regime in the rest of Syria, and the Assad regime is very eager to get back maybe that northeast corner of the country because it's a very oil-rich area, and the Kurdish forces who we back use a lot of that oil for revenue generation purposes. It helps their region. And the other country that has a lot of stake in the Syria situation is Turkey, just to the north of Syria, which has historically been battling insurgencies with Kurdish forces, and they are not very pleased that the U.S. is backing a Kurdish force in that part of Syria. And Turkey has at various times basically like invaded south into Syria and done limited operations to kind of clear different areas and hold them. And so that's just the backdrop of like the U.S. is in this corner of Syria. There's a NATO ally to the north who we're trying not to upset, but we also want to continue holding this portion of land, which also upsets the government of Assad, which wants to kind of like make whole its country again. And the government of Assad is backed by Russia. And then within that, you have you have Russian regular forces, and then you have Russian mercenary forces that kind of are organized into a whole bunch of different little mercenary bands, and kind of colloquially all referenced as like Wagner mercenaries, though as I understand it, like none of them are officially like called Wagner on paper. A lot of them are called different things, and they are usually associated with either this umbrella organizations set up by Wagner Associates, or maybe even like independent and serve other purposes. But that's basically the layout of Syria. And so 18, ISIS wasn't yet totally defeated, and there was a deconfliction line that had been set up roughly along the lines of the Euphrates River, and that kind of cuts across Syria's like northeast corner. So the U.S. basically owned things to the east of that, and the Russians would work to the west of that. And that was to prevent all sorts of different problems where Russian and U.S. fighter pilots maybe bumping into each other, and it hasn't fully, I think, squashed those issues, but it was at least set up with the purpose of limiting the blowback if something went wrong there. And in addition to that, there was also like a deconfliction line set up, so like the U.S. could call and ask, Russian officials like, hey, are these your guys? Or, hey, you're doing this? Or, hey, we just want to check here. We're doing, just deconfliction, make sure like they don't run into each other. So on the night of like February 8th, 2018, there was a JSOC element with about 30 people in total. That was a mix of like Delta Force guys, Rangers, I believe, and then also combat controllers from the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, the Tier 1 combat control unit. So these 30 guys were at like a place called Kanoko Fields. It's basically like a gas station, or not a gas station, a like oil field area with probably a refinery. And so they were basically there with their Kurdish partner force, doing some counter ISIS stuff. That hasn't fully come out, like what exactly their mission was, but you can kind of guess it was probably to prevent ISIS from like regaining control of some of these oil fields, and also maybe doing a little bit of pre-offensive planning against ISIS forces. Regardless, the JSOC element was at this oil field area going late into the night, and they were planning on remaining overnight. But early in the afternoon, they had noticed, like around 3 p.m., they had noticed like a massing of forces on the other side of the river. And it was looking like it was like heavy artillery, like main battle tanks, T-72 battle tanks, and gun trucks in general. And so these forces are all like massing up. And there's an initial call that goes out from the U.S. side to the Russians and asks them, hey, are these your guys? And the Russians deny it. And so the afternoon proceeds. The understanding on the U.S. side is that these aren't affiliated with Russia or Syria. And anyone who knows about the hodgepodge of the Syrian civil war knows there's an entire alphabet soup of different militias and tribal groups and extremists and, you know, moderate rebels and whatnot. So it could be anyone. So these guys are like massing there, but there's a lot of them, and they have a lot of like conventional military equipment, the kind of stuff like you didn't really see in like the war in Afghanistan, like a main battle tank. And so these guys are all massing, and then like around, I think maybe like 10 p.m., they start basically trying to ford the river, I think crossing it like a bridge, and some warning shots go out from the American side. And I don't know the exact distance. I think it was like probably like almost like a mile from like these two parties were like almost a mile from each other, but it was, you know, clear they were coming over the deconfliction line, and the warning shots aren't heeded, and then that turns into actual shots being fired. And sometime in that mix, possibly before the warning shots, possibly like after, artillery starts getting fired. Heavy artillery is landing like within 500, a couple hundred meters of like U.S. positions. And the Delta Force guys basically ask another Green Beret team, which is at a mission support site, you know, quite a bit of ways away, to start spinning up like a quick reaction force, get your gun trucks ready, and come, you know, back us up here. So those guys start moving out. While craft, you know, when, you know, there's not a lot of U.S. troops in a theater, and then they start getting troops in contact, every aircraft is getting pushed to that area. And so my understanding is like the JTAC, who was embedded, the combat controller who was embedded with these Delta Force guys, was getting like F-22s, AC-130 gunships, B-52s, like drones. Everything was getting pushed to him, and he started using it. So this firefight starts happening. The Delta Force guys are like responding with their weaponry. I think mainly like what they were firing back with was like ATGMs, like guided missiles, anti-tank missiles, and 50 cal machine guns. It wasn't like at the range where like you could use a carbine, as far as I understand it. It was more of like a distance of like 1,500 to 2,000 meters. And so that's also the best distance for aircraft to be getting utilized as well. So they were utilizing the aircraft, trying to silence the artillery at the same time as like these vehicles are apparently moving towards the Americans. And the Green Beret team that was spun up as a QRF is trying to make their way, but the roads are just demolished. There's a lot of craters in them. There's down power lines. And so they have to roll in like blackout conditions as well, because of, you know, security concerns, in case like if they have a bunch of headlights coming up and they're a clear convoy moving, they're, you know, a duck, a perfect target. So they're rolling in blackout conditions, like watching through thermal and night vision, and you know, making their way over to the fight. And they get there right about the time, I guess, the artillery kind of gets silenced by the airstrikes that are happening. But the massive forces still appears to be moving. The battle tanks are moving, and they're also shooting. So like another round of volley of fighting kicks off. The aircraft, some aircraft at that point are obviously out of Winchester, they're out of ammunition, and they're heading home. Others, you know, arriving on station. And the U.S. just kind of throws, like, I think everything it had at this problem at the time, everything in theater at the time. You know, it's tough to know, like, whether the massive forces were like so dead set on just taking this oil field, or if perhaps they were continuing to move for other reasons. But suffice to say, like, they even dismounted at one point and like continued to try to move up. And that's when, like, I think a lot more of the casualties actually started to happen from the airstrikes. And I've seen other reporting, like there's a good report by Der Spiegel, a German outlet, that says one of the reasons why they continued to move forward was because they were actually trying to collect their dead. They weren't trying to like continue to take the oil field. And so that kind of explains like the stubbornness, because this whole like incident went on for like 3 or 4 hours. I mean, they just kept like advancing. So ultimately, they repelled the attack. U.S. forces suffered like 1 wounded, and I think that was just one of the Kurdish partner forces. So I don't know how you sustain an artillery barrage like that and not take any wounded, but they managed to do it. I guess they had really good defensive positions. And at the end of it, one of the things you had mentioned it, my reporting on it was I figured out that they had awarded an Air Force Cross to the JTAC who had been involved in this. Don't know his name. He was a combat controller assigned to the Tier 1 unit, of course, and he basically received the Air Force Cross for like, the citation's pretty thin, but it sounds like it was effectively, stepping out in front of fire coming from artillery, main battle tanks, and continuing call in airstrikes throughout all that. And the Air Force Cross, not a small award. I mean, that is second only to the Medal of Honor. I've covered in the past when I was at Military Times Tier 1 units that received like distinguished service crosses, and in the past I've been told that sometimes like a service cross will get awarded because it's not really feasible to award a Medal of Honor, because that comes with a lot more high profile kind of events attached to it. And so sometimes, and you've seen this from like the Vietnam War, sometimes service crosses get upgraded decades later. I don't know if this is a situation where the actions like warrant a higher medal. I had some people asking me that. But, suffice to say, you can read the citation. I think I posted it on my Twitter account, or I pinned it on my Twitter account. And it is pretty thin, but, just the idea that like someone was calling in airstrikes against like main battle tanks and stuff, that's not something like a lot of American citations have in the modern era. Maybe some Ukrainian ones at this point and some Russian ones against Ukrainians, right, but not something American forces have like routinely faced. So all in all, pretty shocking incident. I think one of the, if I could just go on a little bit longer, I'll just say like one of the controversies surrounding it is obviously anytime like nuclear powers clash, there's a lot of concerns about like, could this blow up? Pretty much immediately, the Russians distanced themselves from it. I think the deconfliction line continued to be used throughout the fight, and ultimately, like sometime in the middle of it, the Russians did say that they had some forces that were embedded with this mass. And one of the enduring questions is like, how many Russians were there? I mean, you had a lot of statements after the fact that seemed to indicate it was like hundreds of Russians had been killed, or at least imply that hundreds of Russians had been killed. I think it was probably just based on like further reporting that has been done and families that have like posted tributaries to, their family member who died in Syria, and like other investigative work that has been done by a lot of outlets. It seems like it was probably more like a dozen to 20 Russians were actually involved in this thing, which makes sense, if they're actually operating as like a unit that trains some militia forces. And, on top of that, another enduring question is like, to what extent was it something that the Russian government was aware of, that the Syrian government was aware of? I think there's plenty of opportunities in Syria for, just like in Afghanistan, local businessmen / warlords to pay people to do things for them. And again, this is a part of Syria that has very, very lucrative oil fields. And so getting those back in your control is imperative. There's a lot of speculation that can be done, but ultimately that was like the run of what we know based on like the open source reporting about the firefight and how it went down. Yeah.